Hello students, welcome to the lecture on communication, its interpretation. And after this lecture we will be able to learn the following objectives. Understand the basics of communication. Explain the channels of communication. Define the importance of communication. Discuss verbal and nonverbal communication. Explain the 7 C's of effective communication. Let's start with a brief introduction to communication. Communication is a learned skill. However, while most people are born with the physical ability to talk, not all can communicate well unless they make special efforts to develop and refine this skill further. Very often, we take the ease with which we communicate with each other for granted, so much so that we sometimes forget how complex the communication process actually is. Communication is the exchange and flow of information and ideas from one person to another. It involves a sender transmitting an idea, information, or feeling to a receiver. Effective communication occurs only if the receiver understands the exact information or idea that the sender intended to transmit. Many of the problems that occur in an organization are the direct result of people failing to communicate. Processes that leads to confusion and can cause good plans to fail. Let us now discuss the basics of communication. Why some people can communicate so well while others fail to get their message across? What are the elements that must be present in the communication process before it can be successful and effective? Well, communication has been defined as the act of giving, receiving, or exchanging information, ideas, and opinions so that the message is completely understood by both parties.
The sender is the individual group or organization that needs or wants to share information with some other individual group or organization. The receiver is the individual group or organization for which the information is intended. The message is the information that the sender needs or wants to share with other people. A message is clear when it contains information that is easily interpreted or understood. Once the sender has decided what the message is, the next step in the process is encoding. Translating the message into symbols or language that the receiver understands. Once a message is encoded, it is transmitted to the receiver through some medium. The medium is the pathway through which an encoded message is transmitted to a receiver. Just as senders have to translate their ideas or messages into a form that can be to the receiver, receivers have to make sense of the messages they receive. Decoding is interpreting, or trying to make sense of a sender's message. After decoding the message, the receiver has to respond to it, and start the feedback loop. The receiver must first decide what message to pass on to the original sender. If receiver properly interpreted the initial message, and common understanding has been reached, the communication process is complete.
The illustration shows clearly that in communication process there must be a sender who speaks or sends a message, and a receiver who listens or receives the message. The sender sends a message with a certain intention in mind. The receiver of the message tries to understand and interpret the message sent. He then gives feedback to the original sender, who in turn interprets the feedback. This process, repeated continuously, constitutes communication. Voicemail greeting. Smile when you record it. You do not want to sound perky, just pleasant. Listen to the difference when you record the message while wearing a happy face. It might surprise you. Email subject line. Never leave it blank. This rudely assumes that whatever you have to say is so important that the recipients will open it anyway. Think of the subject as a headline. Email message body. In a business-related email, leave out the emoticons, especially when the message is being sent to your superiors or more than one person. All communication. Ask or notice if the recipient has a preferred way to be contacted. Some live and breathe through texting. Phone calls. When on a phone call, be present. It is obvious and disrespectful when callers are distracted and multitasking. Conference calls. Thankfully, many conference calls are muted by the moderator or administrator. Written communication. The tone of voice, facial gestures, and other communication clues are absent in a memo or an email. Types of communication. Communication is a process of exchanging information, ideas, thoughts, feelings, and emotions through speech, signals, writing, or behavior. In communication process, a sender, encoder, encodes a message and then using a medium, channel, sends it to the receiver, decoder, who decodes the message and after processing information sends back appropriate feedback, reply, using a medium, channel. People communicate with each other in a number of ways that depend upon the message and its context in which it is being sent. Choice of communication channel and your style of communicating also affect communication. Types of communication based on the communication channels used are verbal communication, nonverbal communication. Verbal communication. Verbal communication refers to the form of communication in which message is transmitted verbally. Communication is done by word of mouth and a piece of writing. Objective of every communication is to have people understand what we are trying to convey. Verbal communication is further divided into oral communication, written communication, oral communication. In oral communication, spoken words are used. It includes face-to-face conversations, speech, telephonic conversation, video, radio, television, voice over internet. Written communication. In written communication, written signs or symbols are used to communicate. A written message may be printed or handwritten. Nonverbal communication. Nonverbal communication is the sending or receiving of wordless messages. We can say that communication other than oral and written, such as gesture, body language, posture, tone of voice, or facial expressions, is called nonverbal communication. Nonverbal communication is all about the body language of speaker. Nonverbal communications have the following three elements: appearance, speaker, clothing, hairstyle, neatness, use of cosmetics; surrounding, room size, lighting, decorations, furnishings; body language, facial expressions, gestures, postures; sounds, voice tone, volume, speech rate. Process of communication. The goal of communication is to convey information and the understanding of that information from one person or group to another person or group. This communication process is divided into three basic components. A sender transmits a message through a channel to the receiver. The other important feature is the feedback cycle. When two people interact, communication is rarely one way only. When a person receives a message, she responds to it by giving a reply. Levels of communication. Levels of communication are determined on the basis of the number of people involved in the process of communication, as well as on the purpose of communication. Intrapersonal communication. Intrapersonal communication refers to communication with the self. It may be silent or verbal type of communication. Interpersonal communication. It refers to one-to-one interaction between two persons that often occurs face-to-face. The purpose of interpersonal communication is to share information, opinion, ideas, and so on. Interpersonal communication can be further divided into three types. Assertive communication. It is a type of interpersonal communication that has the following characteristics: confidently expressing what one thinks, feels, and believes; raising voice for your rights while respecting the rights of others; conveying meaning and expectations without humiliating or degrading others; based upon respect for someone and respect for other people's need and rights. Non-assertive communication. Non-assertive communication is characterized as inability to express consistently what one thinks, feels, and believes. Allowing others to violate your rights without challenge. Reflecting lack of respect for your own preferences. Others can easily disregard your thoughts, feelings, and beliefs. Aggressive communication. Aggressive communication takes place when someone expresses himself, herself, in ways that intimidate, demean, or degrade another person, pursuing what one wants in ways that violate the rights of another person. Flow of communication. In an organization, communication flows in 5 main directions: downward, upward, lateral, diagonal, external. Downward flow of communication. Communication that flows from a higher level in an organization to a lower level is a downward communication. Upward flow of communication. Communication that flows to a higher level in an organization is called upward communication. Lateral, horizontal communication. Communication that takes place at same levels of hierarchy in an organization is called lateral communication. Example, communication between peers, between managers at same levels, or between any horizontally equivalent organizational members. Diagonal communication. Communication that takes place between a manager and employees of other work groups is called diagonal communication. External communication. Communication that takes place between a manager and external groups such as suppliers, vendors, banks, financial institutes, etc. Did you know? For efficiency in an organization, all the people of the organization must be able to convey their message properly. Now we will study about the channels of communication. In an organization, information flows forward, backwards, and sideways. This information flow is referred to as communication. Communication channels refer to the way this information flows within the organization and with other organizations. In this web known as communication, a manager becomes a link. Decisions and directions flow upwards or downwards or sideways depending on the position of the manager in the communication web. For example, reports from lower-level manager will flow upwards. A good manager has to inspire, steer, and organize his employees efficiently, and for all of this, the tools in his possession are spoken and written words. For the flow of information and for a manager to handle his employees, it is important for an effectual communication channel to be in place. Importance of a communication channel. A breakdown in the communication channel leads to an inefficient flow of information. Employees are unaware of what the company expects of them. They are uninformed of what is going on in the company. Types of communication channels. The number of communication channels available to a manager has increased over the last 20-odd years. Video conferencing, mobile technology, electronic bulletin boards, and fax machines are some of the new possibilities. In order to make a manager's task easier, the types of communication channels are grouped into 3 main groups: formal, informal, unofficial. Formal communication channels. A formal communication channel transmits information such as the goals, policies, and procedures of an organization. Informal communication channels. Within a formal working environment, there always exists an informal communication network. Unofficial communication channels. Good managers will recognize the fact that sometimes communication that takes place within an organization is interpersonal. Let's know the importance of communication. Effective communication is significant for managers in the organizations so as to perform the basic functions of management. Example, planning, organizing, leading, and controlling. Communication helps managers to perform their jobs and responsibilities. Communication serves as a foundation for planning. All the essential information must be communicated to the managers who in turn must communicate the plans so as to implement them. Organizing also requires effective communication with others about their job task. Similarly, leaders as managers must communicate effectively with their subordinates so as to achieve the team goals. Controlling is not possible without written and oral communication. The importance of communication in an organization can be summarized as: communication promotes motivation by informing and clarifying the employees about the task to be done, the manner they are performing the task, and how to improve their performance if it is not up to the mark. Communication is a source of information to the organizational members for decision-making process. as it helps identifying and assessing alternative course of actions. Communication also plays a crucial role in altering individuals' attitudes. Example, a well-informed individual will have better attitude than a less informed individual. Communication also helps in socializing. Communication also assists in controlling process.
I think for all of us at every stage in our career, there's also something really deep to think about in terms of how we interact. Once again, how do you scale yourself in compelling ways? And then this I'll mention two thoughts. And there are two thoughts I learned from a man named Fred Kaufman I have a great deal of respect for, who runs a consulting firm called Exilient. And Fred was an MIT professor. He was an accounting professor. And he learned, tons of stuff about accounting. And then one day he realized that, wow, all the really hard things are not about accounting. They're all about how people interact, how they scale themselves vis-a-vis other people. And he talks about two concepts I think are really important. And the first is authentic communication, and the second is what he calls being a player, not a victim. If you have children, and I do now, you actually learn from them almost how dishonest adults are all the time. So my favorite story is my friend Beth. This is a true story. She was pregnant and she had a 5-year-old, and the 5-year-old said to her, Mommy, where's the baby? She was like, the baby's in my tummy. He was like, Mommy, where's the baby? She's like, well, the baby's in my tummy. Like, well, Mommy, aren't the baby's arms in your arms and the baby's legs in your legs and all that? And she was like, no, the whole baby's in my tummy. And then, her 5-year-old looked at her and said, then Mommy, what's growing in your butt? And kids are really honest. I mean, my 4-year-old will be like, Mommy, that's an ugly shirt. Or, Mommy, I don't like that story. And as we get older, polite society teaches us to have better manners. And we don't walk around telling pregnant women that their butts look big. Please learn that lesson. I'm not suggesting that. And we don't walk around just blunting out the blunt truth, but we're more polite. But you have to ask yourself, if you're in a group, whether it's a friend group or a family circle or in a business that you're trying to lead as an entrepreneur, how do you get to the truth? How do you make great decisions when no one's saying the truth? How do you communicate authentically? How do you figure out what to say and what not to say in a way that's authentic? And what Fred says, and I really believe this is true, is it starts from the fundamental understanding that there is no truth. There's my truth, there's your truth, that everything is subjective. And so if you always start from the position of, this is what I believe, I don't expect you to believe it, I don't think you have to believe it, I'm not saying it's true, you can actually always communicate authentically. Because if you walk in the room, and this gets worse as you get more senior, here's the answer, you're not giving anyone else any room to say anything. And if you walk in the room and say, I believe this for this reason, what do you believe? If you share your truth in that language, you give people room to authenticate, to communicate authentically. And that is hugely important to these relationships at any stage. The second thing he talks about a lot is being a player, not a victim. And if you listen, you realize, once again, to children or to others, that children speak in a passive voice when something they don't like happens. Mommy, the toy broke. Interesting. You were on this side of the room, the toy just up and broke, right? Just up and broke. I didn't do anything, the toy broke. That same person comes to work, the project didn't get finished. Shocking. The project didn't finish itself, right? How often do people use the passive voice? Now, there is no such thing as complete control. Nothing. No one has complete control in any situation. People that leading organizations in some ways have less, because not only do they have to control what they do, they have to help persuade everyone else what they do. But, if you are able to take responsibility, I'm not late because there was traffic. I'm late because I didn't leave early enough to account for the fact that there was traffic. The project didn't get finished not because my partner didn't do it, my colleague didn't do his part. The project didn't get finished because I didn't set up a team where my colleague wanted to do his part. When you take responsibility and you take full responsibility, that is the most empowering thing, and you can do it at any stage. You have to do it if you're raising money as an entrepreneur. You have to do it if you're trying to persuade people to work with you. You have to do it at all stages. And it is in that authentic communication, and it is in that taking full responsibility, that we really find the power to scale ourselves and have the kind of impact we want to have.
Let's take a look at verbal and nonverbal communication. Communication is a key to maintaining successful business relations. For this reason, it is paramount that professionals working in business environments have first-class communication skills. There are three basic types of communication: verbal, nonverbal, written. Verbal communication. Verbal or oral communication uses spoken words to communicate a message. When most people think of verbal communication, they think of speaking, but listening is an equally important skill for this type of communication to be successful. Nonverbal communication. Nonverbal communication includes body language, gestures, facial expressions, and even posture. Nonverbal communication sets the tone of a conversation and can seriously undermine the message contained in your words if you are not careful to control it. Written communication. Written communication is essential for communicating complicated information, such as statistics or other data that could not be easily communicated through speech alone. Written communication also allows information to be recorded so that it can be referred to at a later date. Use of verbal and nonverbal communication. Use of verbal communication. Speak clearly. Do not try and convey several messages at once. Be aware of your pitch, tone, and speed. Our voices can have a significant impact on how our messages are received and heard. Make eye contact. In some cultures, making eye contact can be problematic, but if it is expected, then it can help you to convey your message. Uses of nonverbal communication. There are a number of different uses of nonverbal communication. These are modifying speech. Nonverbal communication has a significant effect on what is communicated. Modifications include positioning of body relative to other people and things, shape of whole body, movement of limbs, head, and fingers, micro-movement of muscles, skin color and texture, voice pitch, texture of voice tone, speed of speaking, sweating, bodily smells, example, pheromones. Replacing speech. Communication can be done without speaking, for example, pointing with feet, legs, hands, head, or whole body. Gestures with fingers, hands, and arms. Tilting of head. Movement of any combination of the 90 muscles in the face. Attributes of verbal and nonverbal communication. Each day, you send and receive hundreds of messages through both nonverbal and verbal communication. Complementary communication techniques. Nonverbal and verbal communications tend to complement one another. If they do not, they can lead to disappointment, mistrust, and confusion. Verbal communication informs. An important characteristic of verbal communication is that it provides direction and information. Nonverbal communication clarifies. Nonverbal communication used makes verbal communication more understandable and clarifies the words that have been spoken. Various methods of verbal and nonverbal communication. Verbal communication methods. Communication is an essential part of all human interactions and is used to connect with others in order to have specific needs met. Spoken communication. Spoken verbal communication generally falls into either the category of dialogue or lecture. Written verbal communication. Verbal communication can also take place via the written word. Letters, memos, texts, and instant messages are all forms of written verbal communication. Elements of verbal communication. Verbal communication may contain many subtle elements that can impact how the communication is received. In both spoken and written communication, word choice and tone are key considerations. Facial expression. Facial expressions are responsible for a huge proportion of nonverbal communication. Consider how much information can be conveyed with a smile or a frown. While nonverbal communication and behavior can vary dramatically between cultures, the facial expressions for happiness, sadness, anger, and fear are similar throughout the world. Body language. Communication plays a very important role in professional life, and we all need to make sure that we have learned all the aspects of proper communication so that we can progress in our careers. When it comes to communication, we put a lot of emphasis on speech and written communication, but we often fail to realize that body language is one of the most important means of communication, which tells more about us than we may speak or write emails. Body language can send a lot stronger signals than words or written text. There are 7 C's of effective communication, which are applicable to both written as well as oral communication. These are completeness. The communication must be complete. It should convey all facts required by the audience. Conciseness. Conciseness means wordiness. Example, communicating what you want to convey in least possible words, without foregoing the other C's of communication. Consideration. Consideration implies stepping into the shoes of others. Clarity. Clarity implies emphasizing on a specific message or goal at a time, rather than trying to achieve too much at once. Concreteness. Concrete communication implies being particular and clear rather than fuzzy and general. Courtesy. Courtesy in message implies the message should show the sender's expression as well as should respect the receiver. Correctness. Correctness in communication implies that there are no grammatical errors in communication. Now in the end, let us summarize what we have learned in this lecture. In communication process, a sender, encoder, encodes a message, and then using a medium, channel, sends it to the receiver, decoder, who decodes the message and after processing information, sends back appropriate feedback, reply, using a medium, channel. Aggressive communication takes place when someone expresses himself, herself in ways that intimidate, demean, or degrade another person, pursuing what you want in ways that violate the rights of another person. Communication that flows from a higher level in an organization to a lower level is a downward communication. The number of communication channels available to a manager has increased over the last 20-odd years. Nonverbal communication used makes verbal communication more understandable and clarifies the words that have been spoken.